In the cold, grey waters of the North Sea, where wind and tide conspire in endless rhythm, lies Scapa Flow, a natural harbour nestled among the Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland. It was here, in the final days of November 1918, that one of the most extraordinary naval dramas of the 20th century began. Not with a battle, but with silence. The guns had fallen quiet across Europe. The Great War was over, at least on paper. Yet for the German High Seas Fleet, the war's end brought not peace, but limbo. Under the terms of the armistice signed on November 11th, 74 of Germany's most powerful warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers were ordered to sail under the white flag of surrender to this remote British anchorage. They arrived in a sombre procession between November 20th and 27th, their decks stripped of armaments, their crews reduced to skeleton complements of officers and sailors, their flags lowered in submission. Over 20,000 German sailors had once manned these vessels. Now, fewer than 5,000 remained enough to keep the ships afloat, but not enough to fight. They were prisoners of peace, waiting in the mist and spray for a fate to be decided not by admirals, but by diplomats in Paris. For months, the fleet lay moored in eerie stillness. The British Grand Fleet watched from a distance, wary but unmolested. Life aboard the interned ships settled into a strange routine. Drills without purpose, meals without appetite, days without horizon. The sailors, cut off from home, uncertain of their future, grew restless. Back in Germany, revolution simmered. The Kaiser had fled, the monarchy collapsed, and a fragile republic struggled to take root. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Allies debated the terms of a permanent peace. Article 231 of the emerging Treaty of Versailles would assign sole blame for the war to Germany and with it, crippling reparations. But what of the fleet? The British Admiralty, haunted by the memory of Jutland and fearful of German naval resurgence, demanded the ships be handed over permanently. France and Italy wanted them divided as spoils. Germany, clinging to the last vestiges of national pride, hoped for their return, or at least their destruction, before dishonour. At the centre of this tension stood Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, career naval officer of Prussian discipline, quiet demeanour, and unshakable sense of duty. Appointed commander of the interned fleet, he lived aboard the light cruiser Emden, watching, waiting, calculating. He knew the armistice forbade the destruction of the ships, but he also knew that if the peace treaty was signed, the vessels would be seized. And if the treaty collapsed? Then the armistice would expire, and with it, the legal basis for internment. In that narrow window of ambiguity, Reuter saw an opportunity, or perhaps a duty. He began planning in secret. Over weeks, he issued coded orders. Seacocks were loosened but not opened. Watertight doors were left unlatched. Valves were marked. The plan was simple, brutal, and absolute. At a single signal, every ship would be scuttled, simultaneously sent to the bottom before the British could intervene. It was not an act of war, Reuter would later insist, but of honour. To let the fleet fall into enemy hands, intact and usable, would betray the sailors who had built it, fought for it, and died for it. June 1919 arrived with tension thickening like fog over Scapa Flow. Peace negotiations in Paris dragged on. On June 16th, the Allies presented Germany with a final draft of the treaty and gave them 7 days to sign or face renewed hostilities. Reuter, monitoring British wireless traffic from his ship, misinterpreted a routine fleet exercise as preparation for seizure. He believed the deadline had passed. On the morning of June 21st, a rare summer sun broke through the clouds, glinting off the masts of the silent fleet. At 10:30 a.m.
Mas
Reuter raised a pre-arranged signal flag on the Emden. Paragraph 11. Confirm. It was the order to scuttle. Within minutes, German sailors across the anchorage sprang into action. Hatches were flung open, seacocks turned, portholes smashed, valves wrenched wide. Water rushed into engine rooms, magazines, and lower decks with a sound like thunder, muffled by steel. Alarms blared, but not from the German ships. From the British shore stations, confusion turned to panic. Patrol boats scrambled. Marines were dispatched, but it was too late. One by one, the great ships began to list. The battleship Friedrich der Grosse rolled onto her side, her hull groaning. The cruiser Bremse sank bow first, vanishing in a swirl of foam. Even as British sailors boarded some vessels, German crews stood at attention on deck, then dove overboard, swimming to safety as their ships slipped beneath the waves. Shoo. By mid-afternoon, 52 of the 74 interned vessels lay on the seabed of Scapa Flow, the single greatest loss of warships in a single day in naval history. Over 400,000 tons of steel, iron and pride had been sacrificed in an act that stunned the world. The British were furious. They called it treachery. They arrested Reuter and his officers, imprisoning them as prisoners of war, though the war, by all accounts, had ended months before. The Germans hailed it as heroism. Newspapers praised the sailors' defiance. In Berlin, the act was framed not as sabotage, but as the final stand of a navy that refused to surrender its soul. Yet amid the symbolism, real human costs lingered. 9 German sailors died that day, shot by British forces during the chaos, the last casualties of a war already declared over. Their names were rarely remembered in the grand narratives of honour and defiance. And for the thousands of sailors stranded in Orkney, the scuttling meant more than the loss of ships. It meant the loss of home, of purpose, of identity. They were no longer a navy. They were men without a fleet, adrift in the aftermath of empire. In the months that followed, the Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28th, 7 days after the scuttling, just as the original deadline had allowed. The irony was bitter. Had Reuter waited, the fleet might have been legally protected until the treaty's ratification. But history rarely rewards patience. Instead, it immortalizes decisive acts, however flawed their timing. The sunken ships of Scapa Flow became both a grave and a symbol. To Britain, they were a logistical nightmare, a hazard to navigation, a challenge to salvage. To Germany, they were a monument to resistance. And to the world, they were a stark reminder that peace, once declared, is not always peace achieved. The moral paradox of the scuttling endures. Was it an act of noble defiance or reckless disobedience? A preservation of honour or a waste of lives and resources? The answer depends on who tells the story and from which shore they watch the tide. But the story did not end in 1919. Beneath the surface of Scapa Flow, the fleet lay in silent repose, tilted on the seabed, entombed in silt and seaweed. For years, they were left undisturbed too deep, too dangerous, too costly to raise. Then, in the 1920s, a new chapter began. A young Scottish engineer named Ernest Cox, driven by equal parts ambition and audacity, launched one of the most remarkable salvage operations in maritime history. With little more than steam-powered winches, compressed air, and sheer determination, Cox and his team began the painstaking work of raising the dead. They patched hulls, pumped out water, and coaxed century-old steel back to the surface. Battleships that had once bristled with guns were flipped upright, refloated, and towed away to be broken for scrap. The operation became a marvel of engineering and a symbol of post-war recovery. Iron from German warships was melted down and sold across Europe, even back to Germany itself. The very metal that had once threatened Britain now helped rebuild it. By the late 1930s, only 7 major wrecks remained on the seabed ghosts of a bygone era, now protected as war graves and historical monuments. Today, Scapa Flow is a diver's paradise and a historian's archive. The cold, clear waters preserve the outlines of cruisers and destroyers with haunting clarity. Barnacles cloak gun turrets, corals bloom in engine rooms, and above, the wind still carries the echo of orders shouted in German, of valves turned, of a fleet choosing the deep over dishonour. The scuttling of the German high seas fleet remains a moment suspended between war and peace, between duty and defiance, between destruction and redemption. It was not the end of naval power, but it was the end of an age when nations measured their might in dreadnoughts, when honour was written in steel, and when a single admiral, watching the horizon from a lonely cruiser, could change the course of history with 3 words. Paragraph 11. Confirm. The legacy of Scapa Flow did not fade with the salvaged hulls or the treaties signed in marble halls. It seeped into the fabric of naval doctrine, international law, and national memory. In Britain, the Admiralty revised its protocols for handling interned fleets, ensuring that future armistices would include explicit safeguards against scuttling proof that even in victory, lessons were learned in humiliation. In Germany, the act became mythologized. Schoolchildren were taught of the sailor's courage. Naval academies invoked Reuter's name as a model of unwavering principle. Yet behind the legend lay a quieter truth. The scuttling also marked the death of imperial ambition. The Kaiser's dream of a world-class navy, built to rival Britain's, had vanished not in battle, but in surrender and self-immolation. The Weimar Republic inherited no fleet, only debt and disgrace. And when the next generation of German naval officers rose in the 1930s under a new regime, they looked not to Scapa Flow for inspiration, but to the skies and the U-boat seeking power in stealth, not spectacle. For Rear Admiral von Reuter himself, the aftermath was complex. Released from British captivity in 1920, he returned to a fractured Germany, hailed by some as a hero, dismissed by others as a relic. He never commanded a ship again. He wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and lived quietly until his death in 1949, long enough to witness the rise and fall of another German navy and another world war. In 1939, as Hitler's regime prepared for conflict, the Nazi propaganda machine tried to co-opt the scuttling as a symbol of national resilience. But Reuter refused to participate in their narrative. To him, the act had never been about politics, it was about the code of the sea, the bond between sailor and ship, the unspoken oath that a vessel should never serve an enemy. That distinction, subtle but vital, was often lost in the roar of later ideologies. Meanwhile, the salvage work at Scapa Flow continued well into the 1940s, interrupted only by the outbreak of World War II. Ernest Cox, the man who defied skeptics to raise the impossible, eventually sold his operation, but his methods revolutionized marine engineering. His use of compressed air to refloat sunken hulls became standard practice worldwide. The iron recovered over 70% of the scuttled tonnage-fueled industries across Europe during a time of scarcity. Some of it even found its way into household goods. Pots, railings, tools, ordinary objects forged from the bones of warships. There is a poetic symmetry in that. The instruments of destruction repurposed for daily life, a silent alchemy of peace. Yet not all was reclaimed. 7 major wrecks remain on the seabed today. The battleships König, Kronprinz Wilhelm, and Markgraf, the light cruisers Dresden, Köln, Brummer and Karlsruhe. They rest in water ranging from 30 to 45 metres deep, their silhouettes softened by time, but still unmistakable. Divers describe swimming through their corridors as entering a cathedral of rust and memory. In the quiet gloom, one can still see porcelain sinks in officers' quarters, brass portholes half buried in silt, the skeletal remains of deck cranes reaching skyward like supplicant hands. These sites are now protected under the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act, a recognition that they are not merely shipwrecks, but graves and historical documents in steel. The ethical weight of the Scuttling lingers in these depths. Was it justified? From a legal standpoint, Reuter violated the armistice. From a moral one, he acted to prevent his nation's military assets from being used against it, a principle echoed in later conflicts. But the human cost cannot be ignored. Those 9 sailors who died were not combatants. They were men caught between orders and uncertainty, shot while swimming away from sinking ships. Their deaths underscore the tragic ambiguity of post-war limbo when peace exists on paper, but violence still finds a way. In that sense, Scapa Flow serves as a cautionary tale about the fragile threshold between war and peace, and how easily the latter can be contaminated by the former's residue. In the decades since, the Scuttling has been reinterpreted with each generation. During the Cold War, it was seen as a warning against unilateral action in tense standoffs. In the age of cyber warfare and drone fleets, it resonates as a reminder that even in defeat, agency remains a force that cannot be disarmed by treaties alone. And in an era increasingly concerned with historical memory and underwater heritage, Scapa Flow stands as both a war grave and a classroom. Marine archaeologists study the wrecks not only for their historical value, but for what they reveal about corrosion, marine ecology, and the long-term fate of human artifacts in the ocean. The very steel that once symbolized industrial might now host colonies of sea anemones and wolf-fish nature, reclaiming the machinery of war, 1 millimetre at a time. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Scapa Flow is this, that the end of a war is rarely clean. Armistices may silence the guns, but they do not resolve the tensions that fueled them. Peace treaties may redraw borders, but they cannot erase pride or shame. And fleets may be interned, but their spirit, whether defiant, broken, or hopeful, lives on, in the choices of those who served them. On June 21, 1919, 52 ships chose the deep. But in doing so, they ensured their story would never sink. It would rise again. In textbooks, in documentaries, in the bubbles of divers tracing their ribs, and ask again and again, what is honour worth when the world has already moved on? Today, a simple stone monument stands on the island of Hoy, overlooking the flow. It bears no grand inscription, only the names of the 9 German sailors who died that day. No flags fly above it, no ceremonies are held. But on calm mornings, when the water is still and the light slants low across the harbour, the surface seems to shimmer with memory. And if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with your understanding, you can hear the echo of a signal flag snapping in the wind, and the slow, solemn sigh of a fleet returning to the sea, not as enemies, but as relics of a world that tried and failed to end all wars. The story of Scapa Flow, however, extends beyond steel and strategy. It lives in the quiet reckonings of those who witnessed it, and in the generations shaped by its ripples. Among the British sailors stationed at the base in 1919, many recalled the Scuttling not with anger, but with a strange kind of respect. One petty officer, interviewed decades later, said, "They didn't run, they didn't beg. They sank their own ships like men who still believed in something. That sentiment, rarely voiced in official reports, reveals a human truth often buried beneath the machinery of history. Even in defeat, dignity can be preserved, and sometimes it is the victor who learns the deeper lesson. In Germany, the psychological impact was profound. The loss of the fleet severed a tangible link to imperial glory, accelerating the Navy's transformation from a symbol of national ambition into a smaller, more pragmatic force under the Weimar Republic. Yet paradoxically, the Scuttling also preserved a myth that the German Navy had never been truly beaten at sea. This stab-in-the-back narrative, already circulating after the war, found new fuel in the image of ships choosing self-destruction over surrender. It was a dangerous fiction, one that would later be exploited by those seeking to revive militarism. But in 1919, for the sailors watching their home vanish beneath the waves, it was simply grief for a future that would never sail. The international community, meanwhile, scrambled to make sense of the event. The Paris Peace Conference briefly debated whether to punish Germany further, but with the treaty already teetering on the edge of collapse, cooler heads prevailed. The Allies realised that pressing the issue might push Germany into outright rejection of the entire agreement. So the Scuttling was quietly absorbed into the larger chaos of post-war realignment, a dramatic footnote, but not a deal-breaker. In naval circles, however, the incident sparked urgent discussions about the laws of war. By the time the London Naval Treaty was signed in 1930, explicit clauses addressed the disposition of interned vessels, ensuring that no future admiral could replicate Reuter's gambit. Law had caught up with legend, but only because legend had forced its hand. Back in Orkney, life slowly returned to normal. The British naval presence at Scapa Flow diminished, though the base would be reactivated during World War II this time to guard against U-boats and German surface raiders, many crewed by officers who had read about the Scuttling as boys. The local islanders, who had watched the German fleet arrive with suspicion and curiosity, now found themselves custodians of an underwater museum. Children played on beaches littered with flotsam from the salvaged ship's bits of teak decking, twisted metal, porcelain shards stamped with imperial eagles. To them, the war was already history, but the sea kept its secrets close, and every storm that churned the bottom brought new fragments to light. Ernest Cox's salvage operation, though commercially driven, inadvertently preserved history in another way. Before scrapping each vessel, his team often documented its layout, recovered artefacts, and even salvaged ship's bells and nameplates, some of which now reside in museums in Edinburgh, Berlin, and Kiel. One such bell, from the cruiser Köln, hangs today in the Labeau Naval Memorial near Kiel, its bronze surface worn smooth by time and touch. Visitors ring it not in celebration, but in remembrance, a soft, resonant note that carries across the Baltic, echoing the final chime of a fleet that chose silence over subjugation. And yet, for all the artifacts saved and stories told, the true heart of Scapa Flow remains beneath the surface. Modern sonar surveys have mapped the wrecks in astonishing detail, revealing how the ships settled in death much as they had sailed in life. Some upright, some capsized, all oriented by the currents of their final moments. Marine biologists note that the wrecks have become thriving artificial reefs, supporting biodiversity in waters once scoured by war. In this, there is a quiet redemption. The very structures designed to project power now nurture life. It is a transformation that speaks to the resilience of nature, and perhaps to the possibility of human renewal. The moral complexity of the Scuttling endures because it resists easy judgment. Was it sabotage or sacrifice? defiance, or desperation? The answer may lie not in the act itself, but in what it reveals about the human condition in the aftermath of catastrophe. When institutions fail, when treaties falter, when the world holds its breath between war and peace, what remains is individual choice. Reuter chose honour as he understood it. His sailors chose obedience or perhaps loyalty. The British chose restraint in the end, allowing the myth to grow rather than crushing it with reprisals. And history, in its patient way, chose to remember them all, not as heroes or villains, but as participants in a moment when the rules had dissolved, and only conscience remained. Today, as global tensions simmer in new theatres, cyber domains, polar seas, orbital space, the lessons of Scapa Flow feel unexpectedly relevant. How do nations disengage from conflict without igniting new ones? How do militaries preserve identity when their purpose is suspended? And what do we owe to the symbols of our past when they no longer serve the future? These questions, first asked in the mist of an Orkney morning in 1919, have never truly been answered. They drift like the ghostly outlines of sunken hulls just below the surface of our collective memory, waiting for the next generation to dive deep enough to see them clearly. And so, the fleet sleeps, not in shame, not in triumph, but in silence. A silence that speaks louder than any broadside ever could.